Encroachment on federally leased right-of-way, approximately 11 linear feet. Subject property fence line. Remediation required within the compliance window stated below. That was the language of it, typed flat and small at the bottom of a notice nobody had read aloud yet, because nobody but the man it named was standing there to read it. 2 federal vehicles turned down Sorrel Creek Road for an old man's fence, and the reason had nothing to do with the fence at all. Weldon Purdy stood at the line with a fence stretcher in both hands, 74 years old, working alone on 11 acres that had been in no name but his and his father's before him, while 140 miles of federal jurisdiction and a 6-day compliance window came toward him at 45 miles an hour in a cloud of county dust. 2 men and 1 woman carried between them a survey-grade GPS unit worth more than his truck, a printed easement map with his fence drawn 11 feet onto the wrong side of a line, and the full authority of an agency that did not need his permission to be right. He had none of that. He had a stretcher he'd forged himself in 1974, a shoulder that would not lift past his chest, and all the time in the world, and he did not look up from the wire until the second vehicle had come to a full stop behind the first. If you've ever watched someone stay quiet while they were accused of something they could have proven wrong in a sentence, you already know the kind of patience this story runs on. He set the stretcher's jaw against the post, cranked it 2 clicks, and let the wire find its own tension before he spoke to anyone, which was not yet. The dust settled slower than the doors opened. Down at the property line, 40 yards off, Ruth Purdy stood in her veil with a hive tool in one gloved hand, watching the 2 black SUVs the way she'd watch weather coming, without alarm, only accounting. Neither of them had said a word to the other since the trucks turned in. They didn't need to. 49 years teaches a kind of shorthand that doesn't require the throat. His coveralls were canvas gone soft at every seam, the ghost of a defunct feed mill's name still legible across the back in a font nobody made anymore. He turned his whole body to reach for the come-along on the ground beside him, because the left shoulder hadn't gone above chest height since a training exercise 30 years back, and anyone who watched him work long enough learned to read that turn the way you'd read the first word of a sentence. He finished the splice he was on. He did not hurry it. Whatever those 2 trucks had come to say, the wire was going to be plumb first. The order of his morning had not changed in decades and did not change now. Check the anchor, check the brace, check the wire, check the gate, and only then look up to see who'd come calling. He'd set the corner braces before 7, walked the line with the level before 8, and by the time the sun cleared the tree line enough to throw shadow off the barn, he'd reached the stretch of fence that ran along what the county called the right-of-way and what he called the North 40 rods, a distinction that had never mattered to him until strangers started drawing lines on paper that disagreed with the ones he'd set in the ground. Down at the hives, Ruth lifted the lid of the near box and paused, waiting. He crossed to her without being asked, the whole slow economy of a man who had done this 10,000 times, and checked the strap of her veil where it met her collar, tugging it snug at the buckle, the same 2 fingers finding the same worn leather notch they always found. She didn't thank him. She never did, not for this. She opened the hive. Smoke drifted low and gray across the clover, and neither of them turned to watch the SUVs park, because the bees came first, always, and everything else could wait its turn behind that plain fact. Near his boot, where the fence met the fence line's old bend by the creek crossing, 4 thin metal flags stood in a short row, orange, faded, planted at some distance and depth he had never explained to anyone, including her. He had never dug up what was under them. He had never moved them. He had, in 11 years of neighbors murmuring behind their hands that Weldon Purdy's fence sat farther over than it ought to, never once said what those flags were for. The stretcher hung from his good hand, initials filed into the handle in 1974 by his own knife, worn now to a shine at the grip from 50 years of the same 5 fingers. The younger of the 2 men out of the first SUV was already crouched over the GPS unit, calling numbers to the older man beside him, and something in the third reading made the young woman behind them go very quiet and check her own notes twice. Kellen Montclair had been good at this work for 11 years before he ever set foot on Sorrel Creek Road, and it showed in the first 90 seconds his crew was on the ground. His junior, a broad-shouldered young man named Preston, who'd been with the review office 8 months, read a bearing off the handheld and started transcribing it onto the field sheet before Montclair's hand came up flat, stopping him. "Run it again. You've got a 4-second drift on the satellite lock. That's not our number." Preston reran it, got a corrected bearing within a foot of the printed map, and Montclair nodded once, already moving on, filing the correction the way he filed everything, without ceremony, because catching an instrument error before it became a filed error was the whole art of the job, and he'd built a career on doing it quietly. It was, in its way, real work, done right, and it was the last clean thing that would happen on that fence line for 6 days. Then he clipped the run sheet to his weathered field board, glanced at the printed easement map, and turned to the old man leaning on a fence stretcher 40 feet away. "Sir, per the recorded instrument, this fence sits 11 feet 4 inches into a federally leased right-of-way." He said it loud enough for his own crew to hear, pitched the way a man pitches a line for an audience he's already decided is on his side. 11 years I've been doing this, and I want you to understand something. Most of these encroachments, somebody's grandfather eyeballed a line with a piece of string and a prayer, and everybody downstream just lived with his mistake. He tapped the map once for punctuation. "This is amateur work stapled to good land, and in 6 days it stops being your problem to ignore and starts being mine to fix." His junior laughed, not unkindly, the laugh of a man following his supervisor's lead. Kira Beale didn't. She'd come up 2 counties over, close enough to know fence work when she saw it, and something about the way this line ran, straight where a careless line would wander, true to a bearing no eyeballed fence ever held, sat wrong in her against the printed map's confidence. She said nothing yet. She only watched the GPS numbers scroll past a 3rd time and frowned at a discrepancy nobody else in the yard seemed to want to see. Weldon set the stretcher down against the post, unhurried, and looked at Montclair the way he looked at weather that hadn't decided yet what it was going to do. "Which resurveys that map drawn off?" he said. Not a challenge. A question, small and plain, the kind a man asks when he already half knows the answer and wants to hear it said out loud by somebody else first. Montclair blinked, checked his sheet as if the answer were printed there in a place he hadn't looked yet, and said the survey had been redone 13 years back, all current, all recorded, nothing an old fence line could argue with. "You'll want this moved today," he added, "or I'll need a signature acknowledging the encroachment while remediation's scheduled." He held out a clipboard-free sheet, just paper and a pen, waiting. Weldon didn't take the pen. "Wire's not going anywhere today," he said. "It's been standing since before your map was drawn." "That's not how this works, sir." "No," Weldon agreed, mild as creek water. "I don't imagine it is." Preston, filling the silence the way junior men do, nodded toward the 4 faded flags planted near Weldon's boot. "What are those marking? They're not on any diagram we've got." Weldon looked down at them like a man checking on something that had been sleeping a long time. "I'll show you," he said, "if it comes to that." He picked the stretcher back up, set it against the next post, and went on with the wire. And something in the patience of it, not stubbornness, not fear, just a man finishing a job in the order he'd always finished it, made Kira write a note to herself she didn't yet know the shape of. It came to that within the hour, once Montclair had run out of paper answers and started talking about a survey crew coming Thursday to stake a new line through the middle of Weldon's fence. Weldon set the stretcher down, walked 12 feet along the wire to the crooked old post by the creek bend, and knelt, favoring the bad shoulder without comment, turning his whole body the way he always turned it, until he was low enough to lay the stretcher's flat edge against the sod. He didn't dig. He scraped once, twice, a patient stripping motion that peeled back a foot of grass and root mat like a man folding a blanket he'd folded 1,000 times before. Preston leaned in first, then Montclair, then Kira, and under the sod, set flush into a collar of old concrete gone the color of a river stone, sat a brass disc no bigger than a coffee can lid, corroded green at the rim, stamped with numbers and letters that had not moved in 50 years. "Corpse benchmark," Weldon said, and that was all, and it was enough. Montclair crouched and read it twice before he trusted his own eyes the second time. A survey monument designation, a coordinate reference, a date, Orne 1974, and beneath the date, filed into the brass by a young engineer's own hand decades before any of them had been born into the argument. 2 initials, WP. That's your fence, Montclair said slowly, and it wasn't a question anymore, sitting exactly on a 1974 Corps monument. It's the county's fence, too, Weldon said. Same line, same disc. I said it before I ever strung a wire to it. He looked up at Montclair, not with triumph, just with the flat patience of a man who has been waiting years for someone to ask the right question of the ground instead of the paper. Your map's not wrong because somebody eyeballed a line with string and a prayer. It's wrong because somewhere between this disc and that sheet on your board, the line got moved on paper, not on land. Nobody laughed now. Preston had gone very still over the disc, one hand hovering above it like he wasn't sure touching it was still his to do. Kira had already lifted her phone to photograph it before anyone told her to, some instinct in her outpacing her rank. And Montclair, credentialed, 11 years good at exactly this kind of reading, stood over a brass disc with his own agency's authority stamped on one side and an old man's initials stamped on the other, and understood, before he said a single word about it, that the map in his hand was the thing that needed explaining now, not the fence. The disc did not end anything. It only opened the part of the morning nobody had budgeted for. Montclair straightened up slower than he'd knelt, running a hand along his jaw, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost its pitch for the crew. This monument being genuine doesn't undo 6 days, he said, mostly to himself, mostly to the map still clipped to his board. The resurvey that redrew this line 13 years ago isn't just sitting in a drawer. It's the boundary a pipeline easement got renewed against. There's a signing at the recorder's office in 6 days finalizing that lease on the strip your fence is supposedly sitting inside of. My supervisor ordered this review off that exact resurvey. If this disc is real, we're not fixing a fence line. We're unwinding a contract. Kira had her phone up, framing the disc clean and square, meaning to file it the moment she had signal. I'll get this uploaded to the district office, she said. Get it on record before anybody argues the reading. The reply came back inside 20 minutes, relayed through Montclair's radio in a tone so procedural it barely sounded like a decision at all. The item was to be documented, photographed, and physically retained pending review by records management. The same office, Kira realized with a small, cold drop in her stomach, that had logged Weldon's original 1974 field book as destroyed in a fire 20 years back. The one other proof that could have settled this in an afternoon was already gone. What was left, kneeling half uncovered in a foot of sod, was the only witness the ground still had, and someone above all of them wanted it in a drawer before Thursday. They want to retain a benchmark disc, Kira said, flat, not quite believing her own sentence. Take it off the land it's marking. Montclair didn't answer that directly. He crouched again, studied the disc's casting marks with the eye of a man who had spent 11 years learning to tell an honest monument from a poured fake, and found nothing dishonest in it at all, which unsettled him more than a forgery would have. If I file a formal challenge to the resurvey, he said slowly, I need more than a disc. I need the original data set it contradicts. And I don't have it. Nobody does. It's smoke. Weldon, coiling the last of his slack wire around his palm, said nothing to that for a long moment, long enough that Kira thought he might not answer at all. Then, Records Office lost a lot in that fire. Didn't lose everything. He didn't explain further. He didn't need to yet. He only looked toward the barn once, the way a man looks at a door he isn't ready to open, and went back to the wire, leaving the 4 of them to sit with a fact that had grown heavier instead of lighter. The proof was real, and the world built on top of the lie had 6 days left to become permanent regardless. Montclair spent the better part of the next day chasing exactly the kind of thing he was trained to find, a hole in Weldon's claim, a gap in the chain of custody, anything that would let the resurvey stand and the signing proceed on schedule. He requested the original 1974 survey data through every channel his credentials opened, expecting nothing, since the field book was ash and the disc alone proved a location, not a full data set. What came back, filed under an old regional code nobody had queried in over a decade, was the core engineering data itself, intact, uncorrupted, cross-reference to a monument numbered exactly to the disc under Weldon's fence. The bearing, the distance, the elevation, all of it matched the fence line to the inch. Weldon's line had never been wrong. It was the only fixed point in 6 days that hadn't moved. Montclair sat with that printout longer than he needed to. He had built a career on trusting the recorded instrument over the ground every time, and here was the recorded instrument in its own oldest and least touched form, agreeing with the ground completely. Something in that quieted him in a way the benchmark disc alone had not. The second SUV wave arrived that afternoon, later than the first, the way rank arrives after urgency already has. Jared Quillen came out of it in a plain sedan behind the trucks, 58 years old, regional director, and he crossed the yard toward Weldon at a pace that had nothing performative in it at all. He stopped in front of the fence stretcher hanging from Weldon's hand and said the old man's name, once, the way you'd say a rank you hadn't used in 30 years and weren't sure you still had the right to. Then he said nothing else for a moment. He reached into his coat and took out a small folded map, worn soft at its creases, and set it on the tailgate of the nearest truck rather than handing it over, the way a man sets down something he has carried farther than the distance between 2 counties. "I need to tell you something before this goes any further," Quillen said, and his voice had none of the polish it must have carried into every meeting he'd run in 30 years of rank. "The resurvey that moved your line, I know who ordered it done. He trained me. He's been dead 6 years, and he took a reduced easement fee from the pipeline company to shift this boundary in their favor, and I have spent 6 years not looking hard enough at exactly the map sitting on that tailgate, because looking hard enough meant admitting the man who taught me the job taught me on a foundation that wasn't clean." He looked at Weldon, then at Montclair, whose face had gone the particular still of a man watching his professional lineage rearrange itself in real time. "This was never your mistake to correct. It's mine." Ruth had come up from the hives by then, veil off, hands still faintly smelling of smoke, and stood beside Weldon without a word, the two of them shoulder to shoulder the way they'd stood at 1,000 smaller reckonings before this one. Weldon set the stretcher down against the truck, finally, and looked at Quillen the way a man looks at a debt he never expected to see repaid in daylight. "You were 25, he said. "Water was over the low crossing by a foot and rising, and you'd gone in after your own instrument case." He said it plain, no theater in it, the way he said everything. "I pulled you out by your belt because you'd have gone under trying to save a tripod." Ruth's head turned toward him, slow, and something in her stood very still, hearing for the first time in 49 years of marriage the full shape of a story she had only ever known the edges of. "You never told me that," she said, not accusing, only quiet. The kind of quiet that comes from a lifetime of trusting a man's silences more than most people trust their words. "Wasn't mine to tell without him standing here to own his half of it," Weldon said, and that was as close to an apology as he offered, and it was enough. He looked down at the 4 faded flags by the creek bend, then at her. "Buried a second set of stakes here, going on 15 years back. Never dug them up, never needed to till now." He said it the way he said everything true and hard, 3 sentences and no more. "Figured if the day ever came somebody doubted this line after I couldn't stand here and say so myself, the ground ought to be able to answer for me." Ruth didn't say anything to that. She only reached over and took his free hand, the one not holding the stretcher, and held it the way she'd held it at 100 quieter kitchen tables, and that was answer enough for both of them. Montclair, 20 feet off, had already turned toward his truck without being asked, pulling 3 more folded plats from the door pocket. The neighboring farms along Sorrel Creek Road surveyed off the same corrupted line and started walking the first fence himself, alone, checking it against the old core data with his own boots in the dirt, the way nobody had told him to and everybody understood he needed to. The recorder's office 6 days later held none of the black SUV's urgency, only fluorescent light and a long counter, and it was Quillen who stood at it, not Weldon, laying the original 1974 survey data beside the corrupted resurvey and speaking to a room of clerks and 2 county commissioners in a voice with all its old Polish stripped off. He named the man who'd taken the reduced fee. He named the 4 farms wrongly clipped by the line that fee had bought. He asked that the boundary be restored to the core monuments, all of them, before the pipeline lease could be finalized on ground it had never actually been owed. Weldon stood at the back of the room in his good shirt, Ruth beside him, and said almost nothing the whole hearing, which was exactly as he'd wanted it. When a commissioner asked if he wanted the corrected plat to note his name as the one who'd preserved the original line, he shook his head once. "Put my neighbors' names on it first," he said. "Their acres got clipped same as mine. Mine's already got my initials in the ground. That's plenty." The plat was corrected that afternoon, 4 boundaries restored to a 50-year-old brass disc, and the field data that had never once been wrong, and the pipeline lease was rewritten to reflect a line that had, in fact, always been exactly where Weldon Purdy's fence said it was. Weeks later, the SUVs long gone from Sorrel Creek Road and the county's business settled into paper the way business settles when nobody's watching anymore, Weldon hung the fence stretcher back on its nail in the barn, initials worn smooth against his palm one more time before he let it go. Ruth folded the corrected survey plat once and tucked it into her apron pocket without ceremony, the way she tucked away anything that had finally stopped needing to be carried in the front of her mind. Together, in the low gold light that comes right before a summer evening gives itself over to dark, they walked the mended line from the barn to the creek bend and back, past 4 faded flags that had finally answered every question anyone would ever ask them, with nothing left between them that needed proving. Some lines get redrawn by the people who never walked them. This is what happens when the man who set the original stake is still standing on it.